Cybercriminals are using social engineering loaded with urgency and fear to successfully prey on victims, your employees, or your customers. Protect your Office 365 email from today's most sophisticated attacks with Barracuda Email Threat Scanner. It's a free tool to help protect your business from these hard-to-detect attacks. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner uses artificial intelligence to hunt and eliminate Office 365 email threats. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email right now. Get your free email threat scan at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. In our July 22nd technical training at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, you'll learn how guided SaaS NDR enables rapid response. That's with Gigamon. Peter Stewart, Adrian Sanabria, and myself will be presenting. If there was another webcast announcement, I missed. Okay, good. I thought I screwed up my teleprompter. Of course, you can view the entire archive if you missed one of our webcast and or technical trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. Joining us now, Jack Rhysider. He's the host of the Darknet Diaries Podcast, a podcast dedicated to telling interesting stories in hacking and information security. Jack worked as a network security engineer for 10 years at an MSSP, got burnt out, wanted to start a podcast and hear about hacker stories. He joins us today to talk about his journey from network security engineer to podcast host. And I can say I'm a huge fan. Jack, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. And actually, we did meet once before. It was DEF CON 18. That was my first DEF CON I went to.
Nice.
And I asked a friend, what is there something I should go acquire when I'm there? And someone said, get a copy of some rainbow tables. And I said, well, where would I even find that? And they said, check with Paul's Security Weekly.
Yeah.
So I came up to your booth. You actually had a booth. I'm not sure what you were selling.
Probably T-shirts.
You had nothing on your booth.
Cigars.
You said you were sold out.
Probably T-shirts.
But I asked you, can I have some rainbow tables? Do you have them for sale? And you brought this huge spindle of CDs out and said, this is the only copy I have and I'm not giving them away.
Well, that's awesome. Well, I've appreciated your contributions to the security podcasting community and our hacker community in general. Jeff was a guest on one of your shows, an episode I greatly enjoyed.
Something I've done and you haven't yet.
That's right.
Yeah, it was certainly an honor.
He talked about his days at the NSA and stuff. It was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So, Jack, how did you get your start in information security?
I mean, I got a degree in IT, and then from there, I couldn't get a job. But then I went back to school and got my CCNA. And from there, I was able to get a job in the NOC, so just monitoring networks for customers. And just went crazy with certs. Got CCNAs, CCNP, the professional. This is Cisco networking stuff. And then an opening came up for a security engineer. And I didn't really know what that was, but I was like, it has the title engineer. That's been my life goal. I'm going for it. And it was perfect. Like security is where I think I belong, because getting a degree in IT, you learn a little bit about everything. You know, I took one class in Java, one class in Perl back in the day, and one class in Linux, and one class in operating systems. And, you learn a little about everything. And so when I got into security, I had to know a bit about everything. And it was just such a perfect match for me. And then from there, I just went crazy with certs, the security certs, Cisco, security certs and checkpoint certs and Juniper certs and all this kind of stuff. And it was just managing the firewalls and intrusion detection systems and SIEM tools in our customers' networks.
It sounds like you've been in the industry for quite a while. Talked about intrusion detection and checkpoint and things like that.
Yeah, 10 years is how long I spent at that company. So, yeah, it's been a while.
That's awesome. And you do seem to have a very broad knowledge. The commentary that you have during your interviews, I think is fascinating. You do a great job of breaking things down as your guests are talking about various topics in information security. I'd imagine you drew on your experience as a network and security engineer. Yeah, I think so. I mean, somebody told me once that if you can explain complex tech topics simply, there's money in it. And I never got it. I was like, what are you talking about? There's no extra money for being able to explain to my team
that this is how this, thing works. And I'm not going to go be a teacher somewhere. Mm-hmm. But it turned out that, there is money in it. And, I was blogging, explaining all kinds of things with my blog. I had a blog where I was like, you try to figure out something at work and you can't. And there's no like articles out there that explain this error code. And so I'm going off the map, right? So if I'm doing that and I'm calling up the vendor or whatever and figuring out on my own, I'm blogging about that. How did I solve that? And so there's a lot of 7 years of blogging before I got into the podcast, where I was getting these complex topics and trying to explain them as simple as I could.
That's awesome. What made you want to start a podcast in security specifically?
Well, I love podcasts, and I was I was looking for the podcast that was, stories of InfoSec. And I at the time, I had been consuming pretty much every security podcast out there, right? So I blew through tons of your episodes, and I was listening to tons of things. And one of the guests you had on back then was McAfee, right? And he just went on and on about this story about going to Belize and getting hunted and tricked and trapped and on the run. And I was just so glued to that story, even though it really wasn't InfoSec related so much, but it was, the old InfoSec guy was there. And I was just like, this is so good. Like, how come there's just not more story time of this is what happened to me, but InfoSec related? And so I really like that. And I just really liked shows like This American Life and Radiolab. And I thought, why can't we merge the two of, let's just go into one story for like a whole hour. And I couldn't find it out there. And, the podcasts at the time were either interview based like yours or news based, or just going into like some topics or something, but it didn't really have any story element to it. So, it was just kind of a lack of there being anything out there that I wanted to listen to, and decided to give it a shot.
It's funny that you mentioned Radiolab, because that's what your podcast reminds me of most often. It's like, you should be on NPR. I should be listening to this on the radio.
Yeah, that was a big influence of mine, is like, let's take that concept but turn it into InfoSec stories.
Cool. But no, I was sorry, Lee. I was just going to ask you, like, finding stories. It seems to me like when I listen to your show, I'm like, how did you even like find that story? Like, did you think that someone might have had that story? Do you find interesting people? Like, how do you discover? I mean, I want to don't give away your secret sauce. Please don't.
Oh, I'm happy to give it away.
All right, then give it away.
Yeah. So, it started out just like you, right? Knowing the people in the industry, who's giving talks, what are the talks on? You already gave a talk at DEF CON, like Jason Street, for example, right? He's given 100 talks at DEF CON, talking about all the ways that he's broken into buildings. And it's so interesting to listen to Jason Street talk. And so I'm like, this guy has to be on the show telling me a story about when he broke into the wrong bank in Beirut, right? It's an amazing story. You're aware of what's in the industry, and you're aware of what stories are out there. And so I started with that, right? I'm tapping on a bunch of shoulders. You already gave that talk here. Can you give it again on my podcast? Okay, sure. Right. So people were sharing things like that, as well as the stories that are out there in public. I was just getting into them and researching and trying to find anyone connected with it. And I love the people who were there for it. I don't want these industry experts or anyone who's just talking at a 10,000 foot view. I don't mind if it's your third day on the job and you were there for that breach. What was going on, right? So like that's what I'm looking for, the people who were there.
Yeah.
And so, as I did that for a while, I started to develop another strategy, which was getting some Google alerts set up. So like one Google alert I have is hacker sentenced. If that shows up in any news article, it means that a hacker was sentenced, right? But let's go backwards. They were arrested. They were found guilty. Then they must have done some sort of crime. What was the crime? What did they hack, right? So when an article shows up, hacker sentenced, it doesn't typically hit maybe your radar, because maybe we talked about that 4 years ago, right? Of this person.
Yeah, like I touch on those sometimes, but I don't often dig in.
Yeah. But for me, I love this slow news type of thing where it's like, okay, now we can go back 5 years, get the beginning, middle, and the end of this story, and we can know everything about it. Did the customer...
Like, who was the dude you interviewed that had the train in the background? That was an unbelievable... That was amazing.
So then that leads to... once I got big enough, people started bringing me stories, and that guy with the train in the background came to me.
Yeah.
Right as he was in the halfway house, so he wasn't even fully integrated back into the world, but he was in prison for 9 years, and he was in the halfway house talking around, and somebody said, "Hey, you got to talk to Jack and share your story with him." So people are coming to me out of prison now with these tell-all stories, and it's sometimes stuff nobody's ever heard of.
Yeah, that was such a real interview. That was really amazing.
That's funny because I wasn't sure if I should add the train, because the train just kept going by interrupting our interview, and I was like, this sucks.
It added an element of realism, certainly, because here's this guy, he got out of prison, he's in the halfway house, and like it triggers the empathy. Like, I really felt bad for him, and on top, like, just for his general situation, but then on top of, like, this dude has to live in that house where the train is going by all the time. Like, that's gotta really suck.
Yeah, it was weird. Yeah, so now I'm lucky enough that I've hit the luck, like that. There's different kinds of luck in the world, and now I'm lucky to be the guy that's the go-to for these kind of stories. Yeah. And now the stories are just coming out of the woodwork. It's crazy how many stories are coming my way now that I've never been told before.
They're engaging, and I make my kids listen to them as well. Well, I'll talk a little more about that. Lee, I know you had a question.
So you got these awesome hacker stories, and how did you get to a point where you realized you could say, screw the day job, I can do this full time and make a living at it? And what was that transition like?
Yeah, well, I was at that company for 10 years, and they were bought out by another company, new management. The way they were set up, I didn't like. So I was kind of burnt out at the same time. So a whole bunch of changes. And I was like, I had this podcast going for a few months, and the people that were into it were really into it. And it's kind of one of those things that that this could be worthwhile. It wasn't making any money yet, but I knew it, if I was hitting the fans this importantly, like you just said, you make your kids listen to it. Like, what other podcasts is out there that you make your kids listen to? It just, like, stuff like that I would hear made me realize that there's something big to this.
And so, Jack, you crossed over into the dark side that I did as well. And that's a scary jump, where you left your day job and did podcasting full time.
Yeah. I gave it like a 3-month thing where I said, okay, I'll quit the job. And I had one Bitcoin that I bought at $600. Mm-hmm. And at that time, Bitcoin was at $20,000. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to sell my one Bitcoin. It's the only Bitcoin I had. And I sold it. And that gave me like a 3-month buffer to just, let's see if I could work on this full time and make it happen. Like, get some money by the end of 3 months. And if it's starting to make a little, then, maybe I can get by a little bit further. So that was kind of my goal, is 3 months, focus on it full time. And sure enough, by the end of the 3 months, I got my first ad deal, which wasn't much, but it was enough to show, like, hey, I could probably hold on to this and it could just grow from here.
Sure. And so are you 100% ad supported?
Yeah. No, I have a Patreon too. So I've got a shop that sells shirts, to Patreon, and the ads.
Awesome. Good.
Can you get a shirt made for each episode's logo that you do?
Almost. Mm-hmm. I do a lot of shirts. I really like just creating all kinds of weird graphics of, like, I don't know, it's just strange stuff. Like, there's this one I have of a person with like a bow and arrow, and they're shooting the arrow, but the arrow is like the USB symbol. And it's just fun to play around with some of these concepts, like a bouquet of flowers, but the bouquet is made of all kinds of network cables and Ethernet cables and power cables and stuff instead of flowers. And so I just like playing with all this art and stuff, and that's why I make the shirts.
So that begs the question, you do your own art?
Well, I come up with the idea, and then I give it to an artist to make.
Gotcha.
So I think I do half the work.
Well, the hardest part has got to be coming up with the concept, the design.
I think so, but you can argue that.
Yeah, and I think the skills, artist has the skills to bring that kind of dream or creative vision to life. So it's a good partnership.
So if I may, since I was interviewed by you, and I literally was one of those people that walked up to you and said, hey, I have a story, you should interview me sometime. Walk us through. I'm curious because all I saw was a few months later you got in touch with me and said, let's do it. What happened in the in-between? How did you vet me, or how do you vet people?
That's a good question.
In your case, it was Chris Kubeka who recommended I talk with you, and we actually met at DEF CON, the last live DEF CON or whatever, and we talked a little bit, and it was just chaotic there. And I said, I'll follow up with you, and I just didn't get a chance to. And then you came back to me, and I said, oh, right.
Oh, that's right. I did say, are we ever going to talk?
Yeah. So, I mean, in your case, I have a researcher that I said, go and figure out what are the good stories. What's the story I should use for Jeff Mann on my show? Because I know he's former NSA and stuff. And my researcher wasn't that good at the time and just reached out to somebody who you knew and asked, and then they reached out to you, and then you ended up just completing a circle and giving me like links to some stories you've already told. And I thought that was great. So I just took those stories.
So you have a researcher that helps you vet your guests and the guest stories, right? Because you don't want someone coming on and just being full of shit.
Yeah, it's almost like a journalism, type of house we've got going. So I've got researchers who get the story, find the story, research the story, fact check after it's written and stuff like that, and that kind of thing.
Jack, you interviewed a young woman who defected from North Korea. And if I had to create a list of your episodes that everyone should listen to, even outside of information security, that probably would be at the tops of my list, and definitely one that I had my children listen to, because I was like, you kids think you have it rough? I'm like, you need to listen to what she's saying right now, because that you guys need to have a world view and look at how things happen outside the U.S., and there are people that are struggling, and it was an amazing story. How did you stumble across that story and put that interview together?
Well, it started at DEF CON. DEF CON has this booth that has the little USB sticks that you shove into...
Yeah, I remember that.
What's it called? Freedom...
Yeah, what is that called? It's essentially... It was. I remembered it definitely. I can picture it in my mind. A big wall where... Would you put your USB key in a slot, it filled with media and content, and that content would go to North Korea?
Yeah, it's the oh my gosh,
thumb drives for freedom or something. Yeah,
FDFF is the name of the place. But yeah, there was this thing at DEF CON, and it was like, give us your USB sticks and we'll take them to North Korea. And I was like, what is this? And so then there was a Wired article that explained it more, and I was like, oh, okay. And so I reached out to them, and I said I would like to do a show about how you're sending USB sticks to North Korea, because there's tech involved with this, and it's interesting. I'm fascinated with North Korea to begin with, right? So I got to talk with the Human Rights Foundation is who runs that, and so I got to talk to some people at the Human Rights Foundation. And they interviewed, right? So I was like, okay, well, this is great. How you're shipping USB drives to North Korea? That's fantastic. It would be really cool if I could get someone from North Korea that I could talk with, and we can connect you. And so from the Human Rights Foundation, I got a connection, and then that took an extra 6 months because she was very difficult to get agreed at the right time and all that stuff. It wasn't so easy. But that was a big deal for me too, to get someone from North Korea, because I'm very fascinated with North Korea, and I know that's not somebody you could just go reach out to. But this is kind of one of the things that I like to do on the show also, which is and that project's called Flash Drives for Freedom. I just remembered.
Yes.
I like to get people on my show that you typically couldn't just go find and reach out to, and I want to get this kind of like secret world and have you exposed to it. And I really like that aspect to the show as well.
What was it like doing an interview like that? Did you go through a lot of prep, or was she just more than willing to kind of share her story, right? Because she wrote a book, right?
Yeah, she wrote a book, and I read the entire book before talking with her, because I wanted to be as familiar as I could with it. And her book made me cry, literally. It was really emotional.
Yeah.
And so, I didn't want her to rehash what was in the book. I just kind of wanted her to, I knew exactly what questions to ask to get the most impact for my show.
And you must do a lot of research for each one of these then, right? This is a very well-researched our style is very different, right? We're kind of a machine that cranks things out. But yours are a slower release cycle, and there's a lot more research and background that goes into them, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've got to know what questions to ask before talking with these people, and then afterwards, is any of this stuff true that they told me? And it's nice having my background in cybersecurity, so I can kind of sniff some bullshit out of the air right away and say, okay, that's not making sense. Backtrack didn't exist in 2010 or something, Coward didn't exist in 2010.
Right.
So how do you keep yourself out of analysis paralysis where you're doing infinite research when you don't need to?
Oh yeah, I go down a lot of side roads. I've got too many tabs open, that's for sure. I mean, it's sometimes I do get lost on what's the story here and where does it start and where does it end, and how sometimes there's too many players and I've got to cut people out and simplify the story and all this. It's tricky. I mean, it's part of the storytelling skills that I had to learn as well, of how to keep it, because it's also storytelling for the ear. It's not just storytelling, but you've got to be able to recognize these names I'm talking about when I go back to talking about that person. So if I have too many names involved, you're just going to be too lost and not know who I'm talking about half the time. So yeah, there's just little tricks I have to do to simplify it, but then keep it interesting.
How long on average does it take you to, once you've done the interview, complete the editing process?
Oh, I mean, each episode takes like 50 hours of work.
Yeah.
And as the first 40 episodes I did on my own, but now I've got a team of, like I said, researchers, 2 producers, 2 sound designers and artists, writers. So I've got some other people helping now.
That's awesome.
How's it feel when you listen to your own podcast, or do you?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, that's the reason why I made it, so I could hear these stories. So usually when I send it out to like a sound designer, they take a month and then they send it back, and I try to completely wipe my head of like what this story was and just listen to it fresh. And that's my favorite part of the whole experience is, I get to listen to this, and it's so exciting or something, right? So I'm still into my own show.
Yeah, that's cool. Awesome though. Most people can't get over the sound of their own voice too.
Yeah. So my voice, I really wanted to sound a specific way. I wanted it to sound like Rami Malek and Mr. Robot, right? It's just this monotone, dead sounding thing. And I asked like some voice coaches, what is that? And they said, he's got serious insomnia, that guy. So, that's the trick. So I stayed up till like 4 a.m. to do my first, maybe the first few episodes. And I tried to get really, really tired and then tell it, which is so weird to like think, okay, turn the mic on, be as tired as possible, and then do the story. But that's the stuff I was going through to try to get that voice, but it just wasn't working for me. It didn't turn out the way I wanted.
Yeah.
So it took me a while to find my voice. I just kept copying other people that I liked, the way they talked or the way they did things, and it wasn't quite exactly the same. And eventually I found my own voice and all that. So it was just a lot of playing around with different voices before I figured it out.
I think it's the voicing that to me is the most reminiscent of the radio show.
Yeah.
I don't have a name for it.
It is more like a radio show, which I think is nice.
The NPR show.
Yeah.
The Radio Lab. I'm sorry.
So with Radio Lab, so the first thing I Googled was, how does Radio Lab make their podcasts, when I was learning, right? And there wasn't good information out there. I since learned that there's a book called Out on the Wire, which is written by the people who did Radiolab, This American Life, 99% Invisible, Snap Judgment, that kind of thing. And they explain how they do stories. So I did kind of get a glimpse of it. But what they do is they kind of memorize the story, and they get so into it, so far, so deep, and they go through it like a few times, and then they just totally get rid of the script and everything, and they all stand up. And I even hear that Jad likes to put one leg up on the table and kind of look like Captain Morgan for a minute. And then they say, okay, turn the mics on, let's tell the story. And so Radiolab feels a lot more off the cuff and just natural in that sense. And my goal was to sound like I'm sitting down at the bar with you, and I want to tell you this crazy story about this cybersecurity incident. And here's the guy that was there with them that did it. And it's just like this more casual, let's just talk about it like we're at the bar kind of thing. So it's less like news reporty and more casual in that sense.
One of my favorite types of stories, which I've heard over and over again, are stories, and you mentioned it with Jason Street, are stories of physical penetration testing. I thought your story recently with the two guys where one of them breaks his ankle, and I probably should have said this, kind of a spoiler. Spoiler alert before I said that. But I thought that was one of the best stories, but I also felt bad that I thought the reason it was an interesting story was because the poor dude broke his ankle.
Mm-hmm.
Did you kind of have that sense like this is going to be really interesting, but the reason it's interesting because the poor dude got hurt?
Yeah, because I mean, this is how I pick stories, though. I pick stories that I think and you think as a listener are going in one direction, but then it just takes a total side turn and it goes totally somewhere else so that you never expected it to go. And those are my favorite stories. And so, my thing is like, here's what we're trying to do, but then here's what happened instead, right? It did not go as planned. And that's how every episode is like that. So, they were trying to do a penetration test, but everything went wrong. Yeah.
But you often, I think probably 100% of the time, nail the elements of a story, right? Characters, conflict, and resolution. And that is a great episode where you introduce the characters, their background, how they're prepping for the thing. Then you introduce a ton of conflict, right? And their struggles, and then the resolution at the end. And I think that formula, you've I don't know if you were conscious of that formula when you're developing your stories, but you've nailed it every time.
Yeah, it's kind of a slow start to it too, because I do have to develop that character. Like, there's the courthouse episode, and I'm sure a lot of people remember this, where the two penetration testers, I think it was Iowa, broke into the courthouse.
Coal fire, right?
Yeah, it was from coal fire. They broke into the courthouse at like midnight to do a pen test on it. It set off the alerts, and they got the police called on him, and they got arrested and had to stay in jail for like overnight. It was a big news story because that's just never happened before. Penetration testers get out of jail; they don't have to stay in jail. And so when they finally were able to talk, they were expecting to go straight to this story, but I was like, no, I want to step back and hear some other penetration test stories that you two have done together. Because when we establish how these guys are professional, they're respectful, they know what they're doing, they're very skilled at what they're doing, and here's some other stories. Now when we get to the courthouse one and it all goes wrong, it gives you a lot more perspective into the whole experience, right?
Lee, Jeff, sorry, did you have questions?
Well,
go
ahead, Lee.
No, actually, I was just going to comment. I was just enjoying the backstory behind what he's doing, because those stories are some of the ones that I don't know. I hear him at conferences. I talk for weeks about them. My wife and I both do. We love them, and then just encapsulating the podcast. It sounds obvious now, but it's brilliant that you're doing that. So that's where my head's at.
Yeah, and I was trying to figure out if I should. I'm on the fence of should I be telling these stories for people like you, who are deep into the InfoSec space already and know this story, like everyone's heard this story, or should I tell it to the general audience where they just don't know anything about InfoSec stories? And I've tried to figure out, do I need to pick a side? And I don't think I do want to pick a side. I think I want to continue to entertain people like you, even though you've heard this story. It's fun to say, okay, I want to hear from their point of view. I want to hear that part as well. And that's really interesting for us, as well as being able to deliver it to the common audience.
Well, I think we listen to it from different perspectives. A practitioner would say, oh, crap, that could be me, and learn from it that way. Whereas somebody who's not in the industry is like, holy crap, that's possible? Whoa, how did you not die? Kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Which are both cool perspectives.
Yeah, and what I've learned from that is that the people who are not in the industry know a lot more about computers than we give them credit for. Like, these are the people who are like, I don't know how to get my printer to work. And then they're the ones who are like, that was really interesting how they used a Active Directory vulnerability bypass to get traversal through the network. Like, what are you talking about? How do you know about that now? Just because I mentioned it on the show. Like, they know a lot more than we give them credit for.
I guess what I'm thinking is, because I was on Darknet Diaries, and I think, that's, a feather in my cap. It's an achievement. And yet, hearing you talk, I think I'm more impressed with, and what I think you've tapped into is A, it's the storytelling, but B, there's so many people out there that have had stuff happen to them that for whatever reason they're not ever going to get up and tell their story at a conference for whatever reason, and giving them a platform, giving a chance to tell the story. It reminds me of all the times in my travels. I haven't done it recently because I haven't been traveling recently, but I used to like to go to blues bars, and I would hear these amazing musicians that nobody's ever heard of. Yeah. And I'm like, these guys are better than the top, all the big name bands. I go to different music conferences, and you hear all these incredible musicians, but they're never going to make it big because it's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll. So giving people, regular everyday people the opportunity to tell their story, I think that's probably more impressive than you don't need to go to all the famous known people in our industry anymore. Maybe sprinkle it in once in a while, but they get their platform, they get their chance to talk. The opportunity that you're giving more people to talk, and the fact that they're approaching you and you're researching them and giving them a fair shake, I think that's very cool.
They not only get their 15 seconds of fame, they get their 40 minutes or so.
That's right.
It's weird. Like, some of them are actually putting like their episode number in their Twitter handles and stuff because they're so excited to get the show.
How does that feel?
Yeah, it feels weird. When people, but the thing is that at first I was like hesitant to ask these people, like, these people, like, the worst time of their life. Like, tell me again the time when you were arrested and guns pointed at you and stuff,
Yeah,
and
I thought that with the coal fire folks, right? Because I interviewed them and I was like, so like, what was it like to be in prison? I'm like, oh, that was like, I'm digging up like a really horrible memory for them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I was really worried about that. And it as it turns out, like, some of these people have never really got a chance to tell us how it feels, tell anyone how it feels to, from the high to the low. How did it feel to hit enter and take down that website, all the way to how did it feel when you saw your dad's face when the cops came to the front door, They never explained all that to everyone, and and they feel good. Like, there's something cathartic and therapeutic about telling the whole thing and letting it out, and they actually appreciate, like, the way I get into it and the way that we have the conversation. That they feel like it is a fair. Like, I want the listener, I want the guest to think that I did a fair episode on them, and once that happens, then they feel like, wow, my story was accurately done. And it's to the point where I was even impressed. Like, I learned things, right? So, like, I would interview someone and then I'd fact check it with this or that other thing, and they'd be like, "Oh, I didn't even know that happened." And so they were just, a lot of them are just impressed that their story is told in a nice way that they can then point to and say, "Hey, if you want to know more about me, check this out."
I started listening to the Jordan Harbinger show as a result of listening to your show, Jack. How did you get to meet Jordan Harbinger?
I think we connected on Twitter, and then, I don't know how I figured out how he was like a hacker when he was younger, but when I learned about that, then I looked into him more and connected with him and got him on my show.
Just for our listeners, I think Jordan does a great show as well. Are you also a fan of his podcast?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he interviews some really interesting people, like just really interesting.
I think the interview where he interviewed the defector from Hamas was one of his best episodes that I listened to recently. That was pretty awesome.
Hey, a question came in on our Discord server. I will just read it verbatim. How did you break out of the InfoSec bubble with your podcast, or was it always outside, or did it just naturally go mainstream / viral?
I mean, one of the things that kind of inspired me earlier as well is there was a talk by Leslie Carhart and Johnny Xmas, who they were on stage and they said, if you want to be like an InfoSec rock star, don't try to come on stage at an InfoSec conference. Try to go on stage at a different conference like Comic-Con. And if you tell the people at Comic-Con that you're a hacker, then they're going to go crazy and be fascinated with you and interested. And they're going to fill that room. If you give a talk at Comic-Con about how to hack stuff, they're going to fill that room just as much as any other room in there. And so that really intrigued me of like, wow, how, if we can tell these stories to non-tech people, that would be an interesting thing. So that was kind of another thing that I was, thinking about is how does that work? And so, yeah, I didn't know if I don't know if I really tried to break out of I guess I did a lot of marketing on social media as just by posting a lot and being active, not really, spending money, but I also contacted people who have large audiences, right? So big people on Twitter and news organizations and stuff. And I said, hey, maybe you want to publish, tell your audience about my show. You might find it interesting. And some took me up on it, right? So I got posted in The Guardian and some other places like the Boston Globe wrote about it and stuff. So it hit some other news journals. And I think that kind of got me in bigger as well.
Jack, I think that's great advice, though. In the order is important that you got to create something that you've put all of your passion and drive and effort behind, and then don't be afraid to promote it. And like you said, not everyone's going to pay attention to it, but some people will, and that gets you out there. Because I get the question all the time, like, how do I start a new podcast, right? And I was literally behind the scenes watching you do that. I'm like, you've got great content, and you should be promoting it to all these different outlets. And you did a great job with marketing.
The way I look at marketing is not like a sleazy thing. It's more of like, I want to get it to the people who want this. And that's my whole goal, is not force it upon people who don't want it, but just get it to the people who do. And how do I figure that out? What conferences do they go to? What chat rooms do they hang out in? All these kind of things, and just be there with them.
What are some of your favorite communities to hang out in information security?
Or out of information security?
I think Twitter is my main place I hang out. I was with the Many Hats Club before they closed down, but Discord's got a lot more things coming up. So I have a Darknet Diaries Discord, so whenever I get on Discord, I'm mostly there. But yeah, Twitter's the biggest thing.
Where do you see podcasting in general and/or security podcasting? What's the future hold for us? It's been a wild ride for me, for yourself. Where do you see it going?
I think it's going to continue to grow for a while. I don't like when companies buy it up and make exclusive content on their platform and stuff. I don't think that helps podcasting at all. It just helps that creator and their platform, but doesn't help the place. So I don't like that. I'm more of a free and open kind of person. So
yeah, I agree. I mean, I'm a fan of Joe Rogan, but that's monetarily and maybe popularity wise the biggest example of what you're talking about, right? You can only get it on Spotify. You can only watch the videos on Spotify. You can't watch the full video on YouTube.
Yeah, and I still think even if he made $100 million off of it, I still think it was a bad deal because his was the biggest podcast out there. And if you do the math on how much he could have charged for ads and how many ads he had and all that stuff, I think he was making more than, like, he could make more than that in just a few years or something. It didn't make sense. Like, why would he want to make it exclusive when he could do this other thing? So I think he had some other plan involved, which might have been like, let's see if this thing burns down and then I'm going to walk away with $100 million or something. But right. I don't know. Like, if he can get canceled from that, then it's a good reason for him to quit. Like, he doesn't want to do this forever. He's running out of steam and he just wants to maybe come up with a good reason to get out.
Hey, I have a question to put you on the spot maybe a little bit, Jack, and Paul, I hope you'll forgive me for this, but as a professional podcaster, someone that early on listened to Paul's Security Weekly, and we don't want to be your show, we have our own thing, but what would you tell us as Paul's Security Weekly? What are the good things we do? What would you like to see more of? What would you like to see less of?
Well, when I was getting into podcasts as a security engineer, I was looking at security podcasts. Like, that was my Google search, right? And that was what I was searching in apps and stuff. And so it was easy for Paul's Security Weekly to come up as a security podcast. Like, if I search that term. So because you had that in your title, that made it easy for me to find. And I think that's going a long way. Like you got that. So, yeah, that's good. And yeah, you just do a great job. I don't have any critiques for you. You do a great job finding all kinds of guests and interesting people. And I love the atmosphere you bring. Like you have your own attitude and system.
We have meat candles. You don't have meat candles.
Yeah, don't.
And brown liquor.
Yeah. So it's a good vibe you got going. That's your own, right? So that's the other thing, right? You just get your own thing, and then people like you just for your character, despite whatever the content's about. It's just like the character.
Cool. Jack, are you concerned about cancel culture? Kind of going back to Joe Rogan, someone made the comment that he was too big to cancel, which I don't know that I necessarily agree with. Do you worry about that kind of culture that's happening now?
Yeah, I worry about it. When you have, I mean, I don't want to get too far into it, but like sometimes there's just little things that happen that get a person fired, and it's not like they did anything. I was listening to Sam Harris podcast, right? And this guy wrote a book, and like 4 years before working at Apple, and he was comparing his girlfriend to the people who worked in Silicon Valley, to the other women in Silicon Valley, and he was showing that his girlfriend is better than the other women. And it's just that kind of language alone. When he got a job at Apple, like 4 years after the book came out, some people at Apple thought, oh, he doesn't like the women of Silicon Valley. And so he didn't do anything, physical or hurt, like he perpetuated some things perhaps, but he didn't actually do anything. He just compared it to some other people. And that got him fired from Apple. And it's surprising to me that just, a few words can do that. And and at the same time, Dr. Dre is on the payroll at Apple, who is very negative towards women and has actually some allegations against him. And yet he's still just fine getting paid at Apple.
Well, his history, I mean, he assaulted a woman early on.
Yeah.
And certainly the lyrics to his music are very misogynistic. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I've been a huge Dre fan for a long time, since the early days of NWA. And it was like, cancel culture isn't going after him. Why not? He's not, like you said, he's on Apple's payroll. And it's interesting how choosy it can be, and kind of how picky they can be, and pick on certain words, which I think for us podcasters, right, we say a lot of words in any given week, right?
Yeah, so I get worried that when you have a very loud minority, and it's not like the majority of people at Apple were upset,
right.
but then you got the what Apple wants to be seen as. Like they want to be seen as this certain culture and certain kind of political stance and stuff like that. And they're more concerned with that than they are with people. I don't know. Like it gets really muddy and confusing, and I don't know what to do. Right? When I have some of my favorite comedians or musicians doing things, it's really hard to undo that love for them.
Yeah.
So hard, because it's like, but this was what I grew up loving, and now what do I do? Like this, there's so many great memories. So it's it's very difficult for anyone to watch what's going on and see it when it's close to home, right? When it hits the person who you love that person, right? And now it's that person. It's like
I feel that way with Russell Simmons, right? Being a huge fan of hip hop, and I think the allegations against him are deplorable. But again, it goes back to your point. Like before all that stuff come out, I was like, wow, Russell Simmons is a role model, like huge in hip hop, successful business person, and then all that stuff comes out about him, and it hurts, right?
Yeah. So I don't know what's going to happen with all that.
Jack, what's your, I guess, two-part question? Like, first, what's your favorite episode if you had to pick one, which I know is hard, but also if folks haven't listened to your show, like, do you recommend that they tune into certain episodes that really embody the spirit of Darknet Diaries? Yeah,
I think the favorite for everyone, including me, is Xbox Underground. This is the one where a group of video game players decided to hack into Xbox and video game companies. And the story there is just crazy. It's crazier than I could ever write it, even if it was a fictional story. And it's my favorite because I got like 3 or 4 people involved with it to interview. and just listening to them tell it is just bonkers. But it is a two-parter. So yeah, the Xbox Underground is the name of that one. And it's my favorite because that was the first time that somebody brought me a story. And it was, Sanad is the guy in that story. He just getting out of prison, and he messaged me saying, I don't know who you are, but I was told to tell you my story. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know who you are, so prove that you have like a real story. And he sends me like indictments and stuff. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is huge. And it wasn't a new story. Wired already reported on it. And this is what's really fascinating about my show is Wired reported on it long before I did an episode on it. And then when I do an episode, a lot of people listen to it, and then, Wired recycles some of their content sometimes on Twitter and says, oh, don't forget about this story about the Xbox hackers.
Yeah, that's important.
And every time they post that on Twitter, somebody always says, oh, you should check out the Darknet Diaries podcast. Nice. I'm like, no, guys, they posted a story first.
That's a good symbiotic relationship right there. That's good. Yeah. Because hopefully people check out both works, right? Because I would go read the war and listen to the podcast. You would do both.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you have a favorite cybersecurity books? We've been talking a lot about books. I've kind of gone back myself into a lot of older books and I listen on Audible to my books. And I found that to your point with Darknet Diaries telling stories, there's a lot of great stories from history told in these books. Do you have some of your favorite books?
Yeah, I do. So I really liked Countdown to Zero Day with Kim Zetter.
Yeah, one of my favorites too.
Sandworm by Andy Greenberg. American Kingpin, the story of Ross Ulbricht by Nick Belton. Those are great. One that I think you might not have heard of is The Burglar's Guide to the City. It's a bunch of stories of people who broke into buildings, like actual criminals. And it's fascinating to see how they did it. I also liked Playing to the Edge by Michael Hayden. He was the
NSA director.
Who was he, Jeff?
See, the NSA
director? He was the Dernzo, yeah.
He was a director of the NSA at one time.
Yep.
Yeah, and so he wrote a book on some of the reasons why the NSA does what they do. And it's fascinating to see the other side of it, right? So, he's like, we got all the approvals from all the different courts and all the things before we make any choices. Yeah. And I don't know how much of that is just smoke in my face, but it's interesting. Oh,
let me tell you.
He was the director during Stuxnet, I believe.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, so that one gave me a really good perspective.
Awesome.
I really like the book Bitcoin Billionaires.
Oh,
that was written by the same guy who wrote The Social Network.
Yeah, okay.
Didn't make a movie on Bitcoin Billionaires yet.
Yeah, I was watching a documentary on cryptocurrency that was pretty good. Do you like any of that? Do you go back and watch the documentaries? I think you and I are pretty similar in like researching our industry. And I've watched like every documentary on hackers. Like on Amazon, you just search for hackers. I watch every single one.
Yeah, some of them are a joke, but
some of them are really bad. Yes, agreed.
Yeah. Would you ever consider, maybe you have already, I don't know your entire inventory. Would you ever consider talking to Cliff Stahl? I mean, because his story was turned into a Nova episode where he played himself, but I almost want to hear a Darknet Diaries version of
There's
Cliff
a lot
Stahl's
to that story. The Cyberpunk's book that we talked about goes deeper into that story than even the Cuckoo's Egg.
Somebody was telling me, and I'm not going to remember any of the details, but at some point over the last couple of years when we were talking about Cliff Stahl came up on the show, somebody reached out to me and told me that there's a documentary that was made about the East German hackers.
Yeah. And they're featured in a book,
It's
too.
from their perspective.
Yeah.
And it's like a whole different view of the story.
Cyberpunks goes into that story behind not just the one hacker that was directly the person hacking into Clifford Stahl's systems. He was part of a group. And one of the guys in that group, they said committed suicide by setting himself on fire. Are you familiar with that story, Jack? That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. So there's a bunch of stories that are connected, right? So Cliff Stahl wrote The Cuckoo's Egg, which is some hackers got into the college's network, and he was trying to figure it out. And then he kind of ends the book figuring out who it was, but the story goes on to like who those it doesn't talk about the other side of who those guys were. And there's this movie called 23, which if you're going to look up this movie, don't get the one with Jim Carrey. Get the one that's the German.
The
version.
German. I've heard of this movie before.
That's the one
Jack.
that somebody was telling me about.
I haven't watched it yet.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've watched it, and it goes into it's the other side of the story. So it's the hackers who were hired to do this.
Yes.
And how they did it and all this kind of stuff. And
so they were hired by the Russians to commit espionage, to basically break into the U.S. to steal secrets. Like, they never got anything good. In the book that I read, they basically include, they never really got anything good.
Yeah, and that's where it comes out that somebody died that was part of that.
Yeah. That is a crazy story.
Yeah, I do want to do that one, but I feel like, a movie's made on it, a book is made on it. When stuff is already at that level, I kind of feel like it might have been overdone.
Yeah, like the story's already been told, right? Like, I like your show because you tell the stories that haven't necessarily been told yet.
Yeah, new books that come out, I like to kind of highlight them and just tell other people about it.
Well, it's a wish list item for me, nonetheless.
Okay.
If you can find, an element of the story that hasn't been told yet,
that would be cool.
That would be cool.
The other one that I people want me to do is the Kakata 3301 story. And I'm waiting on that for somebody who was part of it or somehow involved to interview for it. And I'm not going to do it until I get someone from there.
You got any teasers for us, Jack, about what might be coming up?
Not that we're not going to listen anyway.
Right. True.
All your episodes.
Yeah, I got some. People like the pen testing stories, so I've got more of those coming out. And for some reason, it's a whole bunch of old anonymous hackers have just been reaching out to me like crazy. And so a lot of different, fill in the blank sec, right? So not lull sec, not whatever sec, but the third rate and fourth rate secs. All these little groups have been reaching out. So I'm doing my best to kind of figure out who in the heck they are and what were they involved with, and getting those ones. So there'll be a few of those that come out, and then I'm going to do a bunch of stuff on spamming botnets and Zeus and Rye at some point.
If I could make a request, because this was based on a book that I read about Max Butler, aka Max Vision. When or if he's released from prison, I haven't checked lately to see what his status is. I think that would be an amazing interview. I don't know if you're familiar with the story or read the book. Yeah,
I have. The update is he's out, but he's in a halfway house, and he's still recuperating into society. So. Oh,
okay. Well, that's good to know that he's out. I mean, after reading the book, I definitely had a lot of empathy for his story.
Yeah, I think he was the second longest prison sentence ever for cybersecurity crime.
Yeah. Yep. That's cool. That's on my wish list for you.
Do you have any guests on your list that you think there's no way in hell you can pull them off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's your how would we phrase that?
Your bucket list.
Your bucket list of interviews.
Yeah. I mean, there's the 0-day brokers, right? So we're talking. There's some known ones out there, right? So Charlie, what's his name? Charlie
Miller. Yep.
As Twitter says, I'm that 0-day guy. So he likes to be known as the 0-day guy. But every time I ask him, hey, can I talk to you about 0 days? He's like, oh, no. We're not talking about that.
Yeah.
So Charlie Miller, I've asked like pretty much every year. You ready to talk yet?
He'll talk about car. I mean, we had him talk about car hacking and stuff like that. But that's interesting. You've pressed him on the 0-day topic, and he won't do it.
Yeah, and there's some other people like that, which I'm not going to name because they don't like being associated with that kind of thing. But that's the angle, right? They created 0 days and sold it to governments or whoever's the highest payer.
Yeah,
and so it's this gray market.
Yeah, that is super interesting.
So it's come up on Discord. I was thinking the same thing. Do you interview the actual bad guy hackers that were actually doing it for all the wrong reasons and got caught?
Yeah, most of the time I'll interview them after they've done their prison time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's rare for someone to come to me and say, I have all these crimes I've done and I've not been caught for it.
Yeah.
And I'll be able to tell you. But that's starting to come around. That's what's strange. That's starting to come to me.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I mean, that's been requested of us over the years. Jack is like, oh, can you interview someone that like is actually doing these crimes? And I'm like, well, why would they talk to us if they're committing a crime? They haven't been convicted of it, right? But that would be awesome if you could pull that off.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a few already tell me, but it's one of those, how do I prove that you're telling the truth, right? So, like, it was that, I can't remember what it was. There was a big denial of service attack on that DNS provider.
Dine. That was
Dine. Yeah,
Dine.
Yeah, the people who did that reached out to me and told all, but I was like, how do I prove this? Like, how do I fact check this? I've heard your story and your friend's story, and I've seen your Discord, and how do I know it's actually that, right? So it's just really hard to get to that.
Yeah.
Of course, I was wondering about how do you do the fact checking when you're talking to ex-NSA people?
Yeah, that's also difficult, right?
The more ex-NSA people I talk to, the more I can compare, right?
Well, yeah, they corroborate each other's stories.
If you ever have questions, let me know.
See what I mean? There you go.
I can maybe confirm nor deny. But NSA is an interesting beast.
I was told that when you start working at NSA, you're given the book, Cliff Stoll's book, The Cuckoo Egg, to say, hey, get familiar with this, and you'll get a better understanding of what's going on. Have you ever heard that, Jeff?
I have not heard that, but it's coming up on 25 years since I left NSA, so that certainly could be the case now.
Yeah, it's kind of the dated book though, so I'm wondering. I've heard some people say that my show gets kicked around at the NSA as like, this is what you need to know before like, understanding our group or something. So I've kind of replaced that in some way.
Well,
that's kind of cool.
I take issue with that though, because I don't care how old the stories are, the techniques, the motivations, the mindset behind it. Maybe the technology is old, today. But
I agree, Jeff. Holds true today.
The frame of mind, it's timeless.
The human nature hasn't changed, Jeff?
Correct.
You think even when we go to IPv6, it's going to be the same?
That changes everything, Jack. You know that.
It's just like Linux on the desktop. It's coming. Jack, we just have 5 questions left for you. Are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly?
Yeah, let's do it.
3 words to describe yourself.
Teacher, goofy, and curious.
If you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
Oh my gosh, I've heard you ask these questions a million times and I never sorted it out.
It's amazing how people are unprepared for these questions, right? After 16 years.
I think some sort of time travel. Like if I could do all the work and then transport myself to another part of the world and then say, haha, wasn't me.
Or another universe like Loki, right?
Yeah.
If you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Oh man, I don't know about that.
That's a good title, actually. I don't know about
that. The more you give, the more you get.
What is your favorite hacker movie?
Does Mr. Robot count?
That's a TV show.
It's a TV show.
Close. Do you have a movie? Hacker
I guess Sneakers.
Sneakers? There you go.
Who am I siding with on this?
You're siding with me.
You're siding with Jeff on that one, yeah. I'm in the hackers camp. But
Johnny,
Jeff,
are we keeping a tally?
We should be keeping a tally. Jack, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise?
I guess I'd want like somebody really smart and really caring. So Einstein and who was the lady in Lord of the Rings that gave Frodo the sword? She always has like this motherly, caring aspect. She was Mick Jagger's daughter.
Bianca.
Yeah, we know who you're
Or was
talking
that
about.
his wife?
We can't. We're too lazy to Google it at this point. So.
Yeah, so she has this really motherly, caring feel to her. She was an elf in the show, and she knew Frodo had to do this thing, so she didn't want to stop him, but she gave him some help to get there, right? So she gave him a sword, and I was like, man, I wish that was my mom.
Awesome. Jack, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly.
Yes, this was great. I'm so glad to be here.
So nice to have you. For our listeners, make sure you check out Darknet Diaries. Fantastic podcast. Coming up next is the security news. Stay tuned.